Oh, there you are. You're just in time too. I've got a certain story that I think you'll be most interested in. Now, where is it? I must have put it back in the archives. Not to worry, come with me. As vast as our collection is, I always find the hunt to be the most exciting part. Ah, here it is. Now, this is one story that I think you'll be particularly interested in. There's nothing quite like the fantastical tale of a realm set on the edge of a sword. But before we dive in, let me first mention a small disclaimer. There are some suggestive themes and language within this tale, so keep in mind that viewer and listener discretion is advised. With that said, let us begin. As they lifted the body onto the pyre, all she could seem to feel for the man was indifference. The Queen's stoic expression left little room for anyone present to guess how she had felt for the man whom she had been married to for the past 50 years. She stood tall against the bitter wind which ushered in the coming winter, and the fur which lined her emerald green cloak gently kissed the sides of her aging face. Her silver hair hung heavily over her back in a single braid, paying tribute to the long life which she had lived, a life wrought with turmoil. As the ritual began, she curled her arms even tighter into her body, wrapping herself deeper within her cloak. Gorhan, the seer, had arrived to preside over the ceremony and entreat the gods on his behalf. It was rare for the seer to make an appearance unless the gods demanded it, or perhaps his empty pockets. And her husband was certainly not known for his frugality, among other things. So it was no surprise that Gorhan would oblige such an occasion. The old man had covered his body with deep blue inscriptions and symbols of the old language. Like clay, the paint had begun to crack and fade against the open air, but for his eyes and mouth, fresh black tar seemed to drip and run together down toward his throat in one continuous stream. He shook and rattled the bones of animals he had long since sacrificed and lifted his hollow eyes toward the heavens, where he uttered words unknown to those around him. The dark skies above them gave further credence to the man's abilities as he trembled and shouted to the churning clouds. He is rather convincing, she thought to herself. After he lowered his slender arms, the local priests ushered in the two women whom the king had prized most. They wrestled and screamed with their hands bound, pleading for their lives as they were each strapped down on either side of the ashen body, whose eyes had been stitched shut. The drums began to pound as a torch was lit, and Gorhan unsheathed his dagger and swiftly plunged it into the king's chest, wrenching and splitting the bones apart until he could finally reach his hand inside. Their screams grew louder, along with the beating drums, as he dug deeper, twisting and cutting until the king's heart was lifted into the air. He continued to chant as the dark blood spilled over and between his fingers, while they squeezed tighter and tighter around the engorged organ. He then smeared his blood-drenched hand across the women's faces and replaced the heart into its former home. The women cried as they helplessly fought to pull their faces away from his hand, which painted their soft porcelain skin. They struggled tirelessly until their voices were drowned into silence by the gurgling blood that filled their mouths as he drew his knife across their throats. They each grew quiet as life left their bodies, leaving only their tear-filled eyes to watch it drift away from them. Blood dripped and rolled further down into the pyre, and the seer grabbed the torch from the priest's hand, thrusting it into the pile of wood set beneath them. The queen sighed in relief, as if, by some means, her husband would find a way to cheat his death and return to her, fulfilling the dream she'd had the night before. But finally, she could see the man wasting away beneath the flames that engulfed him. She was finally rid of the bastard and his whores. It took everything she had to keep herself from smiling, until something suddenly caught her eye. A dark figure emerged on the ridgeline just beyond the valley, looking down toward the funeral where they stood. She focused harder until she could make out the silhouette of a man seated atop his horse, watching the proceedings from afar. As time passed, she watched as the figure remained stoic in the distance, only watching, perhaps even waiting. Until finally, just as suddenly as he appeared, the rider was gone once more. She watched as the man disappeared behind the billowing black smoke and out of sight. She waited a moment longer, and with her eyes still fixed on the ridge, she signaled for her servant, who approached her and lowered his head with reverence. She leaned toward the man and calmly uttered,
"Send for Ludica."
Beowyn, please. You cannot keep hiding this from Father. If you go, I will not lie for you any longer.
Estrith clung to her brother's tunic as he lifted himself onto his horse, indifferent to her pleas. The frost still clung to the ground as the sun was still yet to peek over the horizon. Her nervous breaths left her lips in a cloud of frozen haze as she scurried to meet his eyes.
"I never asked you to lie for me, sister,"
he replied.
"If you wish to tell him, then I will not stop you."
He then kicked his heels back, forcing his horse onward toward the gate. She watched anxiously, hoping that just maybe he would turn back around, though the fleeting hope quickly disappeared along with her brother into the retreating night. Moments later, she could hear the distant bells toll as the temple signaled to the rest of Elsterheim that a new dawn was upon them. By now, her father would be on his way to pay homage to the gods, and she dare not be late. All she could think of as she made her way to the temple was what she was going to tell him. She'd meant it wholeheartedly when she told Beowyn that she wouldn't lie for him any longer, but protecting him was simply part of her nature. They had been born together, and they had been there for each other ever since. And as much as she hated him at that moment, she loved him too much to let him face their father's wrath. As she entered the temple, she could smell the robust incense clouding the air around her. Numerous priests chanted deeply in the old language while performing the necessary rituals meant to appease the gods. This was to be a new cycle, bringing the next full moon, which meant that Manoth was the god they were to entreat. Outside, the commoners waited for the leaders of Faermire to finish first before they could enter and pay their respects to the highest of gods. Ludica, their king, knelt at the foot of the statue, which had been wrapped in the finest gold. It stretched to the ceiling and towered over the people who stood beneath it. 2 large torches were fixed on either side of Manoth, where a sacrificial table made of black granite sat between them and their god. Estrith quickly winced and lowered her eyes as the priests then brought a young goat onto the table and slit its throat. It was a ritual they had done time and again, but one which she could never bring herself to watch. The blood rolled into the carved gutters along the edges of the table and down into a moat at the foot of Manoth's throne. Her younger brother Sigurd sat beside her and watched with eager anticipation as they then handed the severed head to their father, the king. He accepted the offering and lifted it up toward the god of death before drinking the remaining blood which dripped from the young sacrifice's lips. As he took the final drop, all she could see was Manoth's eyes begin to glow red with fire. The god, though human in form, boasted large antlers from his head, which curled and bent around the brazen halo behind him. In his right hand, he held a sphere with a serpent wrapped around his arm, where on the left was an outstretched hand, waiting for the offering to be presented. The priests then began to chant louder as a deep groan seemed to emanate from the statue itself, and faint whispers echoed through the walls. It was then that the priests signaled for everyone present to lower themselves in reverence to the power which was before them. As she bowed her head to the ground, she took notice that her brother was still watching the events in awe and was unaware of those around him. So she quickly pulled him from his trance and forced him to lower himself to the floor along with the others. The groan grew louder along with the whispers until a pulse of energy rippled through the congregants. Like a muted blow, she could feel the breath of Manoth flow through her chest and out her back, spreading from one person to next. Finally, it faded away once the last of the blood had been drained from the table, and she blew a stiff sigh of relief upon realizing that she had been holding her breath the entire time. Manoth's hollow eyes slowly returned to their previous form as Ludica slowly lifted his head from the ground, followed shortly by the elders of the kingdom. She was glad it was finally over. She hated being in the presence of the great Manoth, but perhaps that was the point. The god presided over those whose lives he chose to take and those he chose to spare. Fearing such a god and giving him the respect which was due would serve those well who chose to take heed. After the ceremony, she made it a point to be the first out the door in hopes of avoiding her father, but soon heard his call before she could make her exit. She sighed with dread and turned to see her brother pull his scrawny hand from the queen's grasp as he took her place as the first through the door. She could hear the giddish tone in his screams as he ran through the courtyard, followed by his friends, wielding their wooden swords as they waged a fearsome battle. She would give anything to be in his place at that moment. Her father spoke briefly with the men who were present before calmly making his way toward her. The elders then made a collective push toward the court, as the queen and the remaining patrons filtered out of the temple while the priests concluded the remainder of their ritual and gladly accepted the offerings presented on behalf of their god. Ludica passively handed an attending priest the cloth which he had used to wipe his face and hardly made a gesture to acknowledge his daughter as he approached.
"Where is your brother?"
His deep voice echoed throughout the room as the two stood alone together. She could feel her insides begin to churn as she responded.
I believe I just saw Sigurd run into the courtyard with Lord Berwin's children.
She scrambled to carry on before he interjected. It was a futile attempt to redirect the conversation.
"I will not ask you again."
She couldn't help then but lower her eyes in defeat. As she opened her mouth to speak, the king's aide appeared through the door.
My lord, the elders are waiting for you in the court.
Ludica kept his eyes fixed on her and calmly answered the man.
"Will they proceed without me?"
Well, no, my lord, you are the king.
The man stuttered with nervousness.
"Then the elders can wait."
Yes, my lord.
The man replied as he bowed his head and slowly shut the door once again.
"I've endured your lies on Beowulf's behalf long enough, Estrith. But no longer. Why have the guards reported to me that they've seen him travel alone toward Valenmoor on numerous occasions?"
I do not know.
Her words were suddenly cut short as she felt the sudden sting of his calloused hand sharply smack the side of her face. The throbbing pain was felt instantly, and she could sense the red print of his fingers emerging on her cheek. She struggled to keep the tears from erupting, but knew the next time she lied to him. He would not hold back.
He is with a woman.
"What woman?"
He would not say.
She felt the second slap reinforce the first. Only this time she could no longer withhold the tears as they trickled swiftly down her face.
I swear on my life, father, he would not tell me.
Her hands clung to her cheek as she struggled to manage her composure in front of the man who towered over her. She couldn't help but see Bewin's face through her father's own resemblance, and felt as if she had been slapped by her own brother instead. Ludica's peppered dark hair contrasted the piercing blue eyes that studied her. The man was built for war, and had the scars to prove it many times over. Though years of battle and politics had proven to wear on his once young and tender good looks as well. He relented to her answer and sighed sharply before shaking his head.
"If he refused to tell you, then it is because he needed to protect her name as well as his own. That boy has only ever chosen to think with anything other than his mind, and will prove to be the demise of everything I have worked for."
He then lifted his hand toward his daughter, gently reaching his palm over her reddened cheek. She hesitated briefly before finally allowing him to touch her face. Her fair skin stood out against the auburn hair that draped gently over her narrow shoulders. Her hazel eyes flickered against the reflection of the torches around her, as she wiped the tears away and struggled to meet her father's gaze once again. The king sighed, and she could see the tension in his shoulders drop along with the sharpened tone in his voice as he studied her.
"If only you were born to me a son, then I would delight in the day that I should relinquish my throne to you."
Her father paused a moment longer, then leaned over and gently kissed her head. The tender kiss left her in a mild daze as she watched the king turn and head for the door, signalling toward his men.
"Find my son and bring him to me at once."
His heavy footsteps echoed with authority, and it was a sound that she could never seem to forget. It was his steps that she could always seem to find amidst a crowded sea of people, and it was always his presence that she somehow feared, yet found solace in all at once. In all her years, she had only ever known the man to smile by the count of the fingers on one hand alone, and 2 of those times she knew to be on her account. But it only took the first, for her to know that she longed to see it even more. It was as if she had been able to unlock a hidden mystery she had never known before, and like an unrelenting thirst, she needed to see it again, if only just once more. Her father's men quickly acknowledged the king as he exited the temple, and she watched as he slowly disappeared behind the door, while it slowly shut behind him. Then, all at once, she could feel the cold and hollow emptiness of the room about her. Like a stiff chill that ran down her spine, she suddenly found herself alone in the hallowed temple, watching the light from the torches bounce against the walls around her. And yet there also was the statue of Manoth which sat before her. Its hollow eyes were all that she could seem to focus on as they peered down at her from across the room. The god of death seemed as if to contemplate her fate as his oppressive stare began to creep into her very soul. Beowyn gently kissed the young woman who clung to his bare chest as the 2 lay quietly in bed together. Her soft blonde hair draped gently over his arm as he caressed her naked hip repeatedly. She smiled and drew her leg slowly over his own before pressing her lips onto his neck. The fire had begun to die, and the cold night air was beginning to break through the crackle of the burning wood.
"Aren't you cold?"
He asked as he tilted his head back and closed his eyes.
"Not anymore,"
she replied.
"You do well enough to keep me warm at night."
The inn where they frequently met was finally quiet. Not an hour earlier, the place had been filled with the loud clamour of its many guests. The ale had done its job well, though, as it seemed that the pair were the only 2 left awake at this late hour. It was a place of ill repute considering their class, but it was well suited for their needs. Beowyn had dealt with the owner on numerous occasions and found that he was a man who cared little to know about his guests so long as they paid their bill. And considering that he was a patron who frequently paid for a room in advance, it was reason enough for the innkeeper not to ask any questions. As they lay together, he couldn't help but recall a man who had sat across from the door as he'd entered the inn earlier that night. Normally, most of the inn's patrons were too involved in their own affairs to notice when another came or went, but on this occasion it hadn't been hard to miss the stranger's frequented glance. Beowyn usually made it a point to limit his time downstairs and would make his way to the room where Tanika would be waiting for him. He would often find himself weaving through the crowd and sifting through the chairs as the thick air permeated with the smell of stale bread and men alike. The only thing which seemed to add a bit of class were the musicians who played by the hearth, albeit slightly out of tune. Tonight, it hadn't been long before he disappeared up the stairs, but he could still feel the stranger's gaze upon his back. Then, as he'd made his way up, he'd noticed the man stand in his periphery and casually leave the tavern. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps he was simply overthinking the mundane. It had left his mind entirely until he found his thoughts drifting later in the night. And now one thought led to the next, reminding him of his sister's words before he left their lands. He knew her warning rang with truth, as it was only a matter of time before his father found out, with or without her help. Though seeing the woman he held in his arms made it worth the risk, even if it was just for another night. He loved her, and she loved him equally. Of course, he had considered countless times the repercussions of their relationship, but couldn't bring himself to end their bond. Tannika was reason enough to forget everything when they were together, but on this night, he couldn't help but be reminded of it all. Finally, he sat up from the bed and pulled the blankets of fur away, resting them on her supple skin.
What troubles you?
She asked.
I grow weary of hiding.
He replied.
Beowyn.
We've carried on like this for far too long. And for what? Our father's feud is their own, not ours.
He continued, audibly reasoning to himself as to why their union was justified, but the longer he argued with himself, the more he found it somehow difficult to believe the reasons he had devised. But finally, the sound of Tannika's voice cut through the noise in his head, though the reprieve was less than comforting, as he soon discovered.
My father would gladly kill you if it meant simply to spite Ludica. I could never bear the thought, Beowyn.
She pulled herself close to him, resting her head against his back. After some time, he heard her hesitantly say the words.
He plans to give me away in marriage by the 1st of spring.
In that moment, he could feel everything within him wrench with pain. His heart sank just as quickly as it flooded with shock to hear the words spill over her lips.
To whom?
Beowyn.
Tell me.
It took all that he had to hide the anguish in his eyes, but to no avail. He watched as she lowered her head to avoid meeting his gaze, and took the moment of the piercing silence between them to gather her words.
There is talk that I am to wed Nothelm, the High Councillor's son.
She waited briefly for a response, but was met instead with a silent disbelief.
I did not wish to tell you for exactly this reason. I'm sorry.
Come away with me.
What?
He was growing desperate, and with all logic and reason cast from his mind, it was all he could think to keep himself from losing her. It even seemed like perhaps he could see that she was considering the notion, if not just for a fleeting moment. The dying light from the fire clung to her golden hair, like an anchor in a blackened sea. The hazel color in her tender eyes disappeared amidst the darkness in the room, but he could still see the worried expression upon her face.
But where would we go? If my father ever needed a reason for war, Beowyn, that would be it.
I don't care.
Stop it! If you truly don't, then you are fool. Think of what you are saying.
Tannika, please.
You are to be king, Beowyn. Do you not think that I would give up everything to spend my life with you? I have spent every waking day trying to think of any possible way this could work, but the truth of the matter is that it cannot.
Tears began to flood her eyes and drip from her cheeks as she turned herself away from him.
I love you with every fibre of who I am, but our love was doomed even before it began.
In that moment, all he could seem to feel was utter despair. She spoke the very words that he tried desperately to suppress within himself, and it cut him even deeper when it was declared. But even when it was said, he still could not bring himself to find the right response. And whether it was the cold seeping in, or the sadness that so quickly overcame her, Tannika began to shiver and pulled her arms closer to her body. The very image of what sat before him was far too much to bear. For she was the one thing in his life that he knew to be right. From the moment he first laid eyes on her, it was as if a new life had taken hold of him, one which brought him happiness for once. And how could one relinquish such a gift when it was all that he was truly able to cherish? It was her love that he longed for, and she freely offered it to him alone. She was everything to him, and for that he was willing to risk it all. But if such a risk also meant the possibility of losing her forever, then he found himself to be at a crossroads. By all accounts, it seemed that he would lose her one way or another, and so it was left to him to decide if one decision posed a lesser risk. But all the while, there she remained before him. And even as the reality of all that they faced grew ever more oppressive, her soft and trembling body called out to him. He could do nothing at that moment but pull her deep into his arms and kiss her. He brushed her golden curls aside and caressed her cheeks as she looked to him for comfort. The two lovers embraced each other as she cried, and he gently wiped the tears from her face. Even as she was overtaken with such sadness, Beowyn could not keep from being lost in her beauty. Whatever the future held, they still had each other in that moment, and for them it was enough. Then suddenly the door flung open as a man kicked his way into the room. Several others followed closely behind, with their knives drawn as they rushed toward the couple. Beowyn reached for Tannika as they pulled her from his arms while she screamed.
Tannica!
he shouted, as he flung his fist at the first man he could find, and then another. The small room grew even more crowded with each passing moment, but if he retained anything meaningful from his father, it was how to fight, even in such a circumstance as this. He fought desperately against the 4 men who surrounded him and nearly succeeded in breaking free of their grasp. But, like cornered prey, they soon overran the young prince, beating him into submission and forcing him to the ground. By the end, he quickly found himself beneath the sharp tip of a blade, being pressed further into the skin of his neck. The man at the other end of the blade pushed it further, forcing him down to the ground as he winced in pain. The others quickly pinned him down so that he could no longer resist the inevitable, and he slowly relinquished his grip as he finally surrendered. "Get him up," one promptly ordered, and they quickly pulled Beowyn up from the ground before leading him back down the stairs. Outside the tavern, the men threw him into the frozen mud, with his nakedness exposed for all to see. Several torches lit the night around him as he lifted his bloodied face from the ground. His sight was blurred, and a mixture of both blood and sweat slowly seeped into his eyes. He was surrounded and felt like little more than the dogs that barked from beyond the circle. All eyes were fixed on him, and the men who sat atop their horses watched with a collective amusement at his humiliation. After pulling himself up, he wiped his face and spat at the mud beneath him. He fought against the instinct to shiver in the bitter cold and took a moment to calm his labored breaths. Before the prince stood a man who towered over him while gently tapping his finger against the pommel of his sword. And before long, the man slowly began to remove his gloves, as if contemplating the young prince's fate. He remained silent and unrelenting as Tannica threw herself at the man's feet, pleading for Beowyn's life to no avail. Instead, he gestured toward his men, who then yanked her from the ground. She cried aloud and wrestled against their grasp, and she reached back toward them as his men forced her onto a horse nearby.
"Father, please, I beg of you."
She cried. Beowyn helplessly watched as the rider seated behind her turned the horse away and kicked his heels back, urging the horse on and into the night. In a single moment, the woman he loved disappeared into the darkness beyond the torch's light. All that remained of her were the distant screams that soon faded just as quickly. The prince quickly found that the moments of contemplation he had earlier in the room were all for naught. For whatever choices he felt lay ahead for him, and Tannica was swiftly made on their behalf. No sooner did he have her in his arms that she was just as quickly ripped away from him. He hadn't even the ability to process the loss of the woman he loved when there before him stood the very man who would seal his own fate that night. He was alone and at the mercy of the king, who had yet to even speak a single word. The man just stood there waiting, patiently formulating his thoughts as his men took their cue from their leader. The prince had nothing to grant him solace and knelt alone in the mud. Then, finally, the man before him opened his mouth to speak.
Beowyn, son of Ludica, what am I to do with you?
The king gently rubbed his brow as he listened to the elders bicker amongst themselves within the court. Word had spread that Greyfeld had begun attacking villages to the south, breeding talk of yet another conflict.
We should have taken the city when we had the chance,
cried an elder from the northern hills.
And risk losing half our army to their stronghold? Your madness rivals only your stupidity. The reason Greyfeld remains is because it stands atop the Golis bluff.
Another argued. The city remained a barbaric fortress between the two kingdoms of Faermire and Mistelfeld. Its borders once expanded well throughout the land for over a century, until Ludica's armies had driven them back in the years that followed. He had considered an attempt to take the city, but couldn't risk further losses with Askfirth, waiting to seize a welcome opportunity against Faermire. Ludica had known that one day the consequences of his decision would come to face him, but what he couldn't understand was, why now? Something had changed. Greyfeld, he feared, was trying to lure them into a trap. Perhaps they were in league now with Askfirth's army, or that of another. The men seated around him argued further, raising their voices in an attempt to speak over one another. An elderly man rose to his feet to silence the court as he directed his address toward the king.
My lord, my people have not the numbers nor the resources to withstand an attack, should they make their way further into our lands.
That's because your gluttony has consumed everything within your villages.
An elder interrupted.
If there is to be war in Elsterheim, it is because you will have squandered your ability to protect the king's road.
How dare you?
The elderly Rodmar's rotund belly jumped with each word that left his mouth, giving further credence to the accusation against him. He threw his finger at the man, and the two began arguing once more, inciting the others to join them. Finally, the king spoke in the midst of them, invoking silence from all who were present.
I am well aware, gentlemen, of the implications regarding these attacks from Greyfeld.
His deep voice reverberated through the court, commanding respect with his tone.
Such action implies that they have lost all sense of reason, or more else, they have found an ally.
With Mistelfeld, perhaps?
One of the men asked.
The scouts report no sign of movement with Askfirth's army. If they were, we would have seen them mobilizing by now, which we have not.
One man replied.
Then who?
Another asked. Ludica could hear the men begin to murmur amongst themselves yet again, and found himself contemplating the barbarian motive just the same. As the elders carried on with their debate once more, the door to the court groaned open with a lamented drone as though it ached with displeasure. Behind it emerged the only man who could actually give account for the barbarian presence to the south.
Pardon the intrusion,
he uttered,
though it seems you have already begun without me.
The man casually walked to his empty seat as everyone watched him, unamused by their silence. Then, as if the thought had nearly left his mind, he nodded toward the king with a passive sense of veneration.
My lord,
he said.
Brother,
Ludica replied.
What news do you bring of the south?
My forces have met the barbarians with little resistance along the border. They have seized Tansby and ransacked the local temple of Shay. But we shall overtake them within a matter of days.
Is that all?
An elder asked, discontented with his response.
Would you prefer they'd have taken Oderberg? Or perhaps Narfolk even?
That's enough, Sidonis.
The king interjected.
Their attacks are reason enough to consider the notion of an alliance with someone else.
Well then, you overestimate them, my king. They are brutes. Nothing more than thieves and pillagers. Chicken snatchers.
The king's brother made little effort to conceal the sarcasm in his voice as he eased himself deeper into his chair. Each seat was ornately carved from a single block of stone, with 8 chairs that lined the court on either side of the throne, where the king sat elevated before them. Adonis waved his hand at a servant who stood nearby and grabbed a chalice of wine as he began picking through the varied fruits on the young man's tray.
The inclination, my lord, that Greyfeld has somehow managed to forge an alliance with anyone is nothing short of nonsense. They cannot maintain a solid governance amongst themselves, let alone an army.
He continued. Further information regarding the ongoing feuds amongst those even worth mentioning made it seem as though the barbarians would just as rather wipe themselves from the face of the earth.
You seem to have an intimate knowledge of the savages, Lord Sidonis.
An elder quipped.
Better to know your enemies well, Lord Haymond, than to know your servants' beds.
He replied as the man promptly slammed his fist down, his outburst quelled only by the king, who rose casually to his feet.
If it is as my brother says, then the barbarians shall be driven back to their lands, and our borders reinforced. I will not provoke a war, if there is none to be fought. Each of you will secure your lands as necessary until I call for you once more.
Ludica could sense the disapproval from some of the elders, while the others approved merely with their silence. It had been some time since all the leaders from the kingdom had gathered together at the king's court, but the conference proved no different than any time before. Only this time, some had arrived more aged and corpulent than ever before. As he stepped down from his throne, the elders all rose to their feet and bowed toward the king, Sidonis, however, remained seated and downed the remaining wine in his cup before eventually joining the others. Once Ludica had left the court, the men also made their way toward the door, trickling out into the cold as they carried on with the subject at hand. From the balcony, Estrith watched her father emerge from the court, brows furrowed and his jaw clenched. He quickly disappeared through the stone pillars as though he were trying to evade a hunting party, one out for blood. It was not her place to know of such things spoken of in the king's court, but it wasn't hard for her to find a means to participate by way of a covered space between the walls. One hidden enough to have gone unnoticed for as long as she could remember. It was her only way of gleaning any sort of meaningful information about the kingdom, her home. Each of the elders gradually left the yard before her as they prepared for their journey back home. Sidonis, however, lingered behind, waiting as the last man disappeared. Curious, Estrith watched as her uncle searched the yard for any stragglers and peering eyes, prompting her to pull deeper into the shadows which cloaked her. After a moment longer, he made his way toward a figure hiding in the corner. He then yanked a woman into the light and kissed her. The two joined eagerly in a passionate embrace before the woman pulled herself away and smiled. In that moment, Estrith watched in disbelief as Rikessa, the queen, stared seductively into her uncle's eyes. She then glanced around the corner and led him by the hand as the two made their way to find their privacy, leaving her alone, still yet in the shadows. She was quick to cover the gasp that nearly left her mouth. As shocked as she was, though, it should have come as no surprise to her that the queen was capable of something like this. Though together with her uncle, this proved to be something else entirely. The woman was cold and cruelly abhorrent of anything that she deemed to be beneath her. She hardly so much as ever granted a passing glance or word at Estrith unless it was motivated by her own self-gain. The equally requited distance between the two women was a precedent which had long been established, and she was more than satisfied with it. As for her uncle, however, the man came and went from Elsterheim whenever he saw fit. His meetings with her father had become less in number over recent years, and his business within the capital was known to only those involved. He was charming indeed, and she admired his ability to gather information, no matter how insignificant it seemed to be. He always managed to know just how to use it when the time came. But also, much like her father, the man was a Volt, albeit more charismatic. And what little times he did converse with her, she always found herself captivated by the stories he told, whether true or not. But seeing the queen with her uncle stirred countless thoughts within her mind, none of which she could seem to make any sense of. Seconds felt like hours as she stood there pondering her next move, and when the thoughts eventually found their way toward logical sense, she emerged from her cover and walked confidently through the corridor once more. The pair had hidden themselves away in a secluded spot at the furthest end of the western wing, safe from prying eyes. Neither of them said a word, but the faint echoes of their tryst could be heard through the door if one listened close enough. It had become the place where Sidonis and his lover, Rikessa, would often meet whenever he found himself in Elsterheim. The two would steal away and indulge themselves in an ongoing passion which had lasted for several years. Though, as of late, their meetings had become less frequent, as did his visits to the capital. As they finished, Sidonis was quick to pull himself away and gather his belongings as Rikessa studied him. He could feel her eyes glued upon his back as he fastened his belt and carried on with a casual and somewhat distant disposition.
"Have I displeased my lord? Or is there perhaps another with whom you have found favour?"
Rikessa tugged gently at her dress and smoothed it over with the palm of her hand. He scoffed at the notion and turned to face her.
"None can please me the way you do, my love. At least not yet."
He chuckled softly, but noted the rapid shift in her expression. He had apparently struck a nerve.
"I have not seen you in months, and when you finally come to me, there is hardly any word spoken between us."
"If it is idle talk you desire, then perhaps Lord Edric's wife would be better suited for the task."
"The woman is no better than a boorish hen, and yet even she knows more about the affairs of our land than I.
It was clear to him that she had learned of Greifeld's movements from talk amongst the elders' wives, a most abhorrent revelation for the queen to be robbed of such first-hand knowledge. Sidonis looked at her as a smirk emerged on his face.
So, then it is more than just talk you seek, and just when I thought you only wanted me for my body.
I want more, my love. I want to be more than just a shadow of an existence. I want more than our childish affair, always hiding ourselves away in secret. I want to be your queen, Sidonis, truly. To rule as a queen should rule by her husband's side, and I want that husband to be you, as it always should have been.
She replied as she slowly approached him. He couldn't help but find himself somewhat taken aback by her words, but they spoke to him in a way that he found enticing. In all their time together, the woman had only ever offered herself to him in a way which satisfied the burning lust he felt for her. But now he grew fonder of her in a new and somewhat endearing light.
And what is it I am to do about your plight, Ricessa? As I last recall, you are married to my brother, the king. Am I to commit treason on your behalf?
To commit treason would imply that you're positioned on the wrong side. What I am merely suggesting, my love, is that you be the man I know you to be and take your rightful place. You are no less a shadow in this world than I, Sidonis. Only I am the one who has no say in the matter.
You have the one thing in this life, Ricessa, that a woman like you has ever needed or wanted, for that matter. You have your throne, your king, your power, and your heir. Do not think for a moment that we were ever alike, shadow or otherwise. Your only fault in all of this is that you still play yourself as the desperate whore.
He felt the sudden sting of her hand smacking the side of his face. Her cheeks grew as red as the fiery hair which draped down her back, and her lips pursed tightly together. He had struck another nerve. He merely chuckled aloud as she stood there watching, overwhelmed by the apathetic insult he'd thrown in her face.
Do not speak to me of what you do not know, Sidonis. My throne and power are both meaningless to a man who sees me as little more than something he can hump. And my son is all that keeps me from being cast aside like the slop they use for pigs. You actually stand a chance to be more than what you are, and yet you have only ever squandered the opportunity. For a man who sees himself as larger than life, you have left little to mark your legacy by. And if you wish to know what others truly see of you, then you have but to merely look at their faces when you enter a room.
Whatever motivation she had to speak to him in such a way came from a place he had never known of her. Be it that she saw him as less a man for the role he played in this life, or merely a pawn in her scheme, he wasn't sure, and truth be told, she saw in him the one thing he hated most about himself, and it vexed him. But at that moment, she had proven herself to be more useful to him than what he had previously thought all these years, though what he could not decide was whether he should subject himself to the defensive barrage of insults, no matter how much they rang with truth. The pair stood together in silence before he finally broke the tension.
Legacy.
Sidonis chuckled as he said the word aloud. Somehow, repeating it made it seem even more imperious. The lingering sting from her slap nearly had him considering returning the favour. Instead, he took a step closer and gently stroked his finger down her cheek, tracing the sharp line of her jaw. Her pale green eyes studied him with apprehension as she waited for him to speak. Sidonis drew himself closer and began to lift a loosened lock of her hair toward his face.
Shadow or not, Ricessa, yours is a legacy that will be forever tied to that of my brother's. His triumphs, his power, and everything in between are what shall be written down for the ages to come. And by his name, there yours will be also, marked forever as the wife of the man whose illustrious reign would stand the test of time. Yet even now you say that it is not enough.
He waited as she looked to him, seemingly searching for the one thing she longed for. She peered deeply into his eyes before finally leaning in for one final kiss and whispered into his ear,
"Make me your queen, Sidonis, and you shall want for nothing."
Days later, the king paced through the castle grounds, sifting quietly through each of the problems that were added daily to his list. First, granting priority to the most pressing issues at hand, and then to the rest. One by one, he created the list in his mind, but the foremost being that of his son. His men had yet to return with Beowyn, and it festered within him each passing hour. The heir to his throne was the last of those he would have chosen to rule, but he was his son, nonetheless. Reckless in every sense of the word, and yet he was the very image of his father. He could not fault the boy for inheriting his own foolishness in youth, but, if the years of hardship had taught him anything, the throne did not care for reasons or excuses. It demanded responsibility, and that was nowhere to be found in young Beowyn. He paced through the halls and into the courtyard, where he suddenly found himself standing before his brother, who had just entered the grounds from within the city.
"I thought you had left,"
he uttered.
"Apologies, dear brother. I was unaware my presence here would prove such a burden."
Sidonis replied,
"My men are in need of supplies and ale. So, I took it upon myself to grant them leave, though we shall be gone by morning if it pleases the king."
He bowed his head in an overly exaggerated manner before taking a large bite from the apple in his hand. He took a moment and studied the king before continuing.
"You are troubled, Ludica. I can see it in your eyes."
"I am always troubled, Sidonis,"
he replied.
"Indeed. I suppose the burden of kingship weighs heavily on those who care enough to be a good king. And a good king you truly are, brother. Far better than I could ever be. But I suppose that is why the gods chose you to rule and not I,"
he uttered, as he lowered his eyes toward the ground. Ludica paused and cautiously looked to his brother. The two men stood in contrast of one another. Sidonis was tall yet slender, his hair dark like that of obsidian, and his eyes a pale and sharpened green. Though he did not match Ludica's brute strength, Sidonis was cunning and often found the advantage through his wit. He longed for the throne, and Ludica would be a fool to think otherwise. Everyone longed for it just the same, and the decades of political games grew heavy on the aging king. He was tired. Ludica could sense his brother's attention drawn to the parchment in his hand. The man's eyes briefly scanned the paper as if hoping to read the contents marked within it, so the king gently rolled it back and carefully placed it at his side. Sidonis softly chuckled at the gesture, noting the somewhat defensive posture Ludica held against his presence.
"Whatever vexes you, brother, I am sure it is of little consequence. You always seem to know just how to make it right in the end, though perhaps it is something more which brings such plight to your eyes. If that is the case, then perhaps I can—"
"I have little time to waste, so tell me what it is you want, Sidonis,"
Ludica asked. If there was anything he grew more weary of, it was his own brother's endless schemes. Though his words were curt, he could see the mood quickly shift in his brother's face as he abandoned the humble facade and returned a stern look into his eyes.
"I want nothing, Ludica, not from you. This land, the home of our father, our ancestors, is everything to me. I would gladly give my life to protect this kingdom, as I have so willingly offered many times over. Do not forget that."
The soft expression on his face suddenly formed a sour and embittered one as he lowered all but his eyes before the king. His words became sharp, and any attempts at civility swiftly fell apart.
"If it is my loyalty you question, then you have truly lost touch with all sense of logic. You may be the king, brother, but do not forget that it is I who protects the throne on which you sit. It is I who safeguards our borders, and it is I who knows all within our walls."
Ludica felt the rage boiling within his veins as he fought with every fibre to contain it.
"Mind your tongue, brother, lest you lose it."
The two men inched closer to one another with hard-end fists and unwavering glares. The tension between them was broken only by the sound of tolling bells in the distance. They could hear the guards shouting from the gates as they scrambled to alert those around them. Skell suddenly appeared from around the corner and approached the men as he lowered his head in reverence toward the king.
"What is it?"
he urged.
"My lord, Elwyn rides from Valenmer to our gates."
The two brothers glanced at one another before Sidonis tightened his hand around the sword fixed at his side and made his way toward the city's gate.
"He rides with his army and Beowyn stands among them,"
the servant continued. Yorick, captain of the guard, soon arrived at the king's side also to give account of their defences.
"Bring me my sword,"
the king demanded. Panic filled the air in the city as the king and his party made their way toward the outer wall which overlooked the palisades. People scrambled to secure their carts in the market, and mothers led their children inside, as others took advantage of the chaos at hand, stealing what they could before scurrying off through the alley.
Move aside.
All the while, Ludica's
Make
men
way.
forced their way through the turbulent
way for the
frenzy
king.
as they cleared a path for
Get
his
back.
company. At the gate, archers stood ready for their order to fire, and soldiers prepared themselves down below. Ludica climbed the steps through the tower and onto the wall, where he could see the numerous orange flags of Valenmoor waving in the wind. A large army stood before them, with his son at the forefront. He was their trophy, displayed for all to see. Elwyn's own 2 sons sat atop their horses on either side of him as they held the reins of his horse close to theirs. Hundreds of painted shields formed a blockade of soldiers behind their king as he proudly approached the city with an air of victory painted upon his face.
Ludica,
The man shouted.
send me Ludica.
Well, I think this may be a good place to stop for the time being. Of course, if I had it my way, I'd just as rather take this read to the very end, but all in due time. There was certainly a lot to unpack with this first episode, wouldn't you agree? I will say, however, that Rikessa reminds me of a gal I once knew from my younger days. Sends shivers down my spine even now, just thinking about her. Ha! I certainly dodged a bullet with that one, thank heaven. But if you are enjoying this story, do remember to like and subscribe with this video so you can be sure and receive the notification whenever the next installment arrives, only here at the Curious Scriptorium. However, if you're like me and just can't seem to get enough of this story, you can find the first novel in the Siege of Akarath series, Dawn of Avarice, available for purchase at any of your major retailers. But until next time, stay curious, my friend.